Tessa needed to hurry, her boots squelching through the mud as she balanced a bucket in one hand and the last of her kindling in the other. The sun was already bowing behind the thick trees, casting long, trembling shadows over the path to her cottage. 3 months alone in these woods had taught her one thing: the approach of winter was merciless. Each day had grown a little shorter, each night a little colder, stretching like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her breath puffed in little white clouds, and every snap of twig or rustle of leaves made her heart skip. But then a sound cut through the rhythmic roar of the river, so faint she almost ignored it. A sharp, frightened whimper that didn't belong to the wind or the branches, barely surfacing over the current's constant chatter. Tessa froze mid-step, water dripping from her fingers as if the river itself had lent her its chill. There it was again, a high-pitched, trembling cry that made her stomach knot. She squinted, straining against the fading light, trying to locate the source. Was it lost? Injured? Or had the forest simply conjured some trick to unsettle her? Halfway across the swollen river, a fallen log had snagged against jagged rocks, forming a precarious little island in the churning water. On it, a dark, shivering shape clung desperately to the slick bark. A wolf pup, no larger than a loaf of bread, its fur soaked and plastered to its tiny body. It struggled to rise, its little paw sliding repeatedly on the wet wood. Each failed attempt sent a shiver through Tessa's chest, a mix of pity and disbelief. She couldn't help but think only in fairy tales do such helpless creatures end up exactly where a human might notice them. Even the idea of giving advice to the pup felt absurd. What could it understand? Words, logic, compassion, it all seemed alien here. Another weak cry echoed across the river, rising and falling like a small heartbeat in the distance. "Where is your mother?" Tessa whispered, scanning the opposite shore. The forest held its breath. No adult wolves appeared. Only the pup, trembling and alone, its tiny eyes wide with fear and curiosity. Tessa swallowed hard. Somehow, someway, this fragile creature had ended up in her path. And she had to decide to stay and intervene, or let the forest handle what it always handled best. But could she really just turn away? Another weak cry echoed across the water, sharper this time, like a tiny bell calling for attention. "Where is your mother?" Tessa whispered, tilting her head, scanning the opposite shore with every ounce of focus. The forest answered only with silence, a thick, watchful hush that made her skin prickle. No adult wolves, no rustling hint of guardians. Just the pup, trembling, shivering, alone as the first fat raindrops began to smear the fading light. The sensible choice hovered in her mind, insistent and cold. Turn away. Return to her cottage. She had barely enough provisions for herself. One more mouth would stretch her thin. Winter was already plotting its cruelty. The wolves of this forest were, by all accounts, not her responsibility. And yet she remained rooted, drawn to the pup's frightened eyes that seemed to ask questions she couldn't answer. The log beneath the pup shifted slightly, wobbling with the river's stubborn insistence. It would not remain trapped forever, she knew. "Foolish girl," Tessa muttered under her breath, already undoing the knots of her boots. She placed them carefully on the bank beside her water skin, as though laying down tiny markers of sanity. The cloak followed, folded hastily, a small island of dryness in the growing storm. Cold water hit her skin, forcing a sharp gasp from her lungs. The river, fed by mountain snowmelt, stole her warmth immediately, numbing her feet, then her calves as she waded deeper. Her skirt billowed and clung, suddenly heavy, every step a battle against the weight. "Stay," she called to the pup, her voice absurdly authoritative over the roaring water, as if it might understand reason in human words. The stones beneath her feet were slick, treacherous. The current tugged at her like unseen, hungry hands. Halfway across, the water reached her waist, thieving her heat, testing her resolve. One misstep could see her tumbling into the river, joining the pup in its desperate predicament or worse. The log shifted again. The pup whimpered, tiny claws scrabbling, its fear radiating across the turbulent water. Tessa pressed forward, each breath a sharp dagger in her chest. Almost there, she gasped, a whisper carried away instantly by the river's roar. 3 more steps.
2.
Her fingers finally grazed the rough bark, closing around the log's edge with careful determination. The pup crouched, small teeth bared in instinctual terror. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, leaning close, letting the words float over the water, hoping the pup could somehow understand that help, not harm, had come for it. Something in Tessa's voice, or perhaps the raw thread of desperation woven through it, made the tiny creature pause. Its trembling body froze for a fraction of a second that felt like eternity. She held her hand steady over the pup, letting it see her intentions without threatening force. Every instinct screamed caution. Every nerve tingled from the chill of the river and the tension in the moment. Slowly, deliberately, she edged closer, careful not to startle it, murmuring words she wasn't even sure the pup could comprehend. And yet, there was a fragile trust forming in that brief stillness, the kind that only desperation, fear, and hope together can coax from the wild. When she lifted the pup, it felt impossibly light, almost unreal in her arms. A small, quivering bundle of soaked fur and trembling limbs, every heartbeat a frantic drum against her own chest. Its tiny body pressed into her, shivering against the cold of her wet clothing, and for a moment Tessa could feel the wildness, the sheer vulnerability, in a way that made her chest ache. Each step back through the river was a negotiation with gravity and the current. Her legs burned from the cold, her muscles screaming, yet every tug of the water felt secondary to the fragile life she held. The current seemed stronger than before, as if it knew she carried something precious, resisting with all its watery might. The pup pressed closer, instinctively seeking the warmth of her body, its tiny head tucked under her chin, shivering but no longer panicked. Tessa allowed herself a small, exhausted laugh as she took the first steps toward the cottage, the mud sucking at her boots, her hair plastered to her forehead. "Food," she whispered, glancing down at the pup, already imagining the meager meal she could offer. Not much, but enough to share, just enough to remind both of them that survival didn't always have to be solitary. And in the rhythm of the falling rain, with the pup's trembling slowly calming against her chest, she realized something extraordinary for the first time since entering these woods. She was not entirely alone. Every step forward was a negotiation with the elements. Rain dripped down her sleeves, soaking through the layers, her skirt heavy and clinging, but the warmth radiating from the pup was steady, grounding. She murmured to it quietly, words of comfort, words she didn't fully believe could translate across species, yet hoped they could. In the soft, insistent pulse of its tiny heartbeat against her own, Tessa found a fragile kind of courage. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them, the wind whispering in the branches, watching, waiting. And even as the rain soaked her to the bone, a part of her dared to wonder what other surprises lay hidden, waiting, in this unforgiving wilderness. The pup nestled closer, shivering against her chest, its tiny paws curling around her wrist. Tessa adjusted her cloak once more, wrapping it securely, folding it so that it shielded them both from the relentless drizzle. She felt its warmth, fragile but insistent, and let herself imagine the small fire she would build, the meager scraps of food she could share. In that moment, each step toward the cabin was both peril and promise, a testament to the strange ways trust could form in the heart of fear. For the first time, Tessa felt a flicker of hope, a small spark of connection in the vast, indifferent forest. The pup pressed its tiny nose against her chest, breathing in sync with her own, as though acknowledging that, for now at least, they were a single unit, a small island of safety in the storm. And yet, beneath that fragile calm, a question lingered like mist in the trees. How long before the wild, with all its cunning and cruelty, reminded them that even a moment of safety could vanish in an instant? For the first time in months, the steady, insistent weight of another living creature pressed against her chest, and Tessa felt the sharp edges of her isolation soften, just enough to let a flicker of warmth in. The forest that had felt vast, indifferent, and sometimes hostile now seemed smaller, less absolute, as if a single heartbeat could carve out a private sanctuary in the wilderness. Every step she took carried a strange duality, fear of the unknown and the unexpected comfort of companionship. Lightning split the darkening sky above her, jagged and brilliant, revealing glimpses of the path ahead through the dense tangle of trees. The forest glimmered briefly, leaves and branches flickering like silver in the sudden illumination. For a moment, Tessa swore she saw shapes moving in ways that defied reason, shadows that danced with intent, stretched and twisted as though the woods themselves were alive and watching. Yet the instant passed. Darkness reclaimed the trees, rain pattering steadily against leaves and pooling in the uneven forest floor. Only the soft, rhythmic breathing of the pup reminded her that some things, at least, were tangible, real. Tessa quickened her pace, each step purposeful but cautious, mud sucking at her boots, water dripping from the hem of her skirt. She did not notice the faint, glimmering eyes tracing her path from the concealment of ancient trunks, watching with patience born of years spent in silence. The forest had seen many intrusions, many acts of desperation, but there was something about her hesitation, her care, her audacity that marked this moment as different. Her act of mercy, small and human, had been recorded by eyes that had long ago learned to see all. The cabin came into view, a humble structure amid the wild chaos of the woods. Morning light filtered through its single, uneven window, painting the rough-hewn floor with a golden hue that promised safety and warmth. Tessa knelt before the hearth, stirring the remaining embers with a crooked stick, coaxing the dying fire back to life. Sparks rose like tiny fireflies before vanishing into the smoke, a reminder that even the faintest effort could reignite something lost. A small iron pot hung from a hook above the flames, water beginning to shimmer as it approached a gentle boil. The pup, now settled on Tessa's only blanket, watched her with those curious amber eyes, head tilting slightly as though silently judging her technique or perhaps simply marveling at the strange ritual of human survival. Its tiny body radiated a warmth that seeped into her own chilled fingers, and for the first time since she had entered these woods, Tessa felt a fragile, grounding sense of home. And still, a question lingered, unspoken, heavy in the room between the firelight and shadows. What other watchers had taken note of her mercy, and what would they do with what they had seen? The rain outside drummed a steady rhythm on the roof, a lullaby and a warning all at once. Tessa's hands worked carefully, bringing the fire to life, tending the pot, arranging the cabin's few comforts as though each action could stave off the weight of the night outside. The pup stirred occasionally, sniffing the air, ears twitching, a tiny reminder that trust had been earned but not yet fully given. She whispered to it softly, words meant as much for herself as for the creature. Food, not much, but enough. Fire, enough to keep us warm. The amber eyes watched, unblinking, absorbing, understanding in some strange, primal way that transcended speech. In the flickering glow, the cabin felt like a fragile island of safety in a sea of wild uncertainty, a temporary haven where survival and mercy met. Tessa pulled the blanket around them both, the firelight reflecting off the wet strands of her hair, illuminating her exhaustion and resolve. Outside, the storm continued, the wind weaving between trees, carrying with it a whisper of the forest's unseen guardians. Somewhere beyond the walls, unseen eyes lingered, patient, calculating. The pup curled into her chest, its breathing slowing, body relaxing into the warmth of her presence. For the first time since she had entered the forest, Tessa allowed herself to imagine the possibility of mourning without fear, of companionship without threat. And yet, the forest never let questions go unanswered, leaving one dangling in the quiet between the raindrops. How long would this fragile peace last, and who or what was truly watching them from the shadows? "You're looking better," Tessa murmured, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, as if speaking directly to the pup's fragile spirit. She reached for a small leather pouch dangling from a nail hammered crookedly into the cabin wall. Its leather was scuffed, the flap worn from repeated openings, yet inside lay treasures of survival, the last of her dried venison, carefully rationed, preserved for the hardest days of winter. Her fingers hesitated over the contents, the weight of necessity pressing against the soft pulse of life she held. Then she tore off a tiny piece, breaking it into manageable bites. I suppose we both need our strength, she thought, offering it to the pup like a peace offering, or perhaps a treaty between wilderness and humanity. The pup's nose twitched, delicate whiskers brushing her palm as it tested the air around the food. Its small eyes, wary but curious, followed every movement, the injured paw lifted tentatively before touching the floor. A slow, uneven shuffle brought it closer, limping with precision, each step a silent negotiation with the ache in its leg. Tessa's lips curved in a small, amused smile, fragile, tentative, but she couldn't help the quiet wonder that crossed her mind. Even the smallest survivors carried courage in the teeth of pain. Careful now, she murmured, guiding the pup's movements with a gentle hand. The pup sniffed, tiny teeth barely showing, hesitant yet curious, absorbing every motion, every scent, like a student learning the strange language of humans. Tessa allowed herself a brief laugh, low and warm, because truly, here in the forest, such absurd partnerships were both necessary and ridiculous at the same time. I don't have much to spare, she whispered, though her voice carried reassurance rather than scarcity. The cabin itself was modest, no more than 4 walls and a sloping roof, yet it had become a sanctuary by Tessa's hands. Long abandoned by hunters and hidden by years of forest reclamation, she had swept away dust and cobwebs, patched leaks with moss and branches, and carefully curated a semblance of home. Each stroke of her broom, each branch fitted to seal the roof, was a small triumph over the wild chaos outside. Here, she had wrested safety from the indifferent wilderness, and now the pup's presence added another layer of fragile, living warmth to the place. Above her, herbs hung from the rafters in messy but purposeful bundles. Wild mint, feverfew, and blackberry leaves swayed slightly as the cabin shifted in the wind, their scent mingling with smoke from the hearth and the damp tang of river water. Tessa's hands brushed over them absently, remembering where she had gathered each leaf, each spring a quiet testament to knowledge born from survival and observation. The pup, now fully settled, nudged the piece of venison toward its mouth, sniffing the air with delicate, intent precision, and Tessa felt a rare, fleeting satisfaction of a small life thriving, here, against the odds, under her watch. The pup chewed slowly, eyes lifting to meet hers now and again, amber gaze sharp, assessing. Tessa sat back slightly, letting the moment stretch, savoring the warmth radiating from her small companion. And for a heartbeat, she allowed herself to imagine longer days ahead, the storm outside less threatening, the forest less hostile. And yet, even as she breathed in the mingling scents of herbs and wood smoke, a quiet, insistent thought lingered. How long could this fragile peace endure in a place that always watches, always waits? The cabin's shadows shifted subtly, cast by the flickering firelight, dancing over walls scarred by time and weather. She adjusted the pup beneath the blanket again, careful not to press on the injured paw. The smell of damp fur mingled with smoke and herbs, a strange but comforting perfume that seemed to anchor her in the present, tethering her to warmth, to life, to a small sense of control. In the corner, the remnants of her survival pouches, sticks, a patched roof spoke quietly of a human stubbornness matched by necessity. Tessa offered the pup another small piece of venison, watching it devour the morsel with careful, deliberate motions. The rhythm of chewing, soft and uneven, combined with the storm outside, gave the cabin a heartbeat of its own. She ran her fingers along the pup's soaked fur, marveling at how something so small could command so much attention, so much care. The forest outside might rage, the elements might batter, but here, in this tiny refuge, life persisted, fragile and tenacious, and for now, that was enough. Her eyes drifted to the bundles of herbs overhead once more, thinking of future teas and poultices she might prepare with them. Mint for warmth, fever for aches, blackberry leaves for sustenance, each a reminder that survival demanded knowledge, patience, and sometimes, a touch of stubborn hope. The pup stirred slightly in response, shifting closer, as if acknowledging not just the sustenance offered, but the sanctuary itself. And once again, Tessa felt the silent, probing question of the forest pressing in what other eyes had been watching, and would this fragile haven be enough to keep them safe from what lurked unseen? A small pile of kindling leaned against one corner of the cabin, each stick carefully stacked as if arranged to withstand the worst of the winter winds. In another corner, a shallow wash basin sat, dulled by use and the river's persistent mist. Her few possessions were neat, almost ceremonial in their arrangement. A change of clothes folded with precision, a sturdy knife with a handle worn smooth by years of use, and 2 books on herbs and healing, their pages soft from frequent handling. Each object told a story of survival, of adaptation, of life pared down to essentials. In the quiet of the cabin, these humble items were a reminder that even simplicity demanded attention, care, and respect. There were no silk sheets here, no silver hairbrush to catch stray locks glimmering in candlelight, no ladies-in-waiting to dress her each morning or to whisper idle gossip about men and fortunes. And certainly no father orchestrating her future, arranging her marriage to a king thrice widowed under circumstances she never questioned because she never had the luxury of choice. Here, the forest and her own hands determined her fate, and that alone was enough to sharpen both her wits and her resolve. Yet in this austerity, there was freedom too, a strange, wild freedom, one the pup seemed to sense in the gentle firmness of her movements. The pup took the small piece of meat from her fingers with surprising delicacy, retreating carefully to the blanket where it could eat in peace. Each bite was deliberate, careful, a tiny display of trust that Tessa hadn't realized she craved until this moment. She watched, her own hunger and fatigue momentarily forgotten, marveling at the creature's instinct to preserve itself, to survive with dignity even in weakness. A faint laugh escaped her lips, soft and private, amused at how even a small wolf could teach humility and patience at the same time. "You're the first guest I've entertained," Tessa said quietly, breaking off another morsel of venison, her tone almost conversational though there was no one but the pup to hear it. "I should warn you, my hospitality isn't what it once was." The truth hovered in the air, feeding another living being would stretch her already meager stores thin, and yet, watching the pup eat, a strange warmth rose in her chest, loosening a knot she hadn't realized had formed from months of isolation and survival. There was a satisfaction here, subtle and profound, in caring for something beyond her own body, beyond her own survival, in feeling useful in a way the forest rarely permitted. As she reached for the pot, intending to prepare a small meal to accompany the venison, her attention shifted. Something had changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The light through the cabin's window flickered strangely, shadows stretching and folding as though moved by something other than the fire. The pup's ears pricked, its amber gaze lifting toward the corner of the cabin that had been empty a moment ago. The air felt heavier, charged with expectation, as if the forest itself had exhaled, watching her, gauging her next move. And for the first time that evening, Tessa realized that the simple act of feeding a small creature had drawn more attention than she could see, unseen eyes tracing every motion. The pup paused mid-bite, sniffing the air, twitching its tail in subtle uncertainty. Tessa's heart stuttered. Instinct told her to check the doorway, the window, the shadows where threats might lurk. But all she could do was watch, careful not to startle either of them. "I hope you don't mind my small comforts," she murmured to the pup, though part of her wondered if the forest itself could hear, judging her audacity, her mercy, her fleeting attachment. Feeding it another small morsel, she felt the strange, stretching tug of connection, a reminder that she had not done this in months, perhaps years, caring for something other than herself. Each chew, each careful motion of the pup's teeth, sent a ripple through her chest, a blend of relief, joy, and unspoken worry. Here in this simple cabin, surrounded by a storm and wilderness, she felt both grounded and exposed, aware that survival could be fleeting, and yet, in this brief, fragile moment, she had reclaimed a fragment of life she thought the forest had taken from her. She paused, her hand hovering over the pot, noticing the subtle change in the room again. The firelight seemed to flicker differently, the shadows stretched too long along the walls, and a quiet, almost imperceptible movement caught the corner of her eye. It was not a draft, not the storm, not the pup. Her heart skipped, awareness sharpening. Something or someone was here, unseen but present, and Tessa felt the forest's patience, its scrutiny, settle over her like a second cloak. The pup's gaze followed hers, ears perked, body tensed just slightly, as though it had felt what she had. Tessa's breath caught. She realized, with a mix of awe and apprehension, that this tiny companion had unwittingly placed them both under the watch of something ancient, quiet, and waiting. And as the fire crackled, shadows dancing across the walls, a question formed, pressing at the edges of her thoughts. What had noticed them, and how long before it made itself known? The constant background murmur of the forest, the soft calling of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant babble of the river had stopped entirely. The silence pressed against the cabin walls like an invisible weight, thick and heavy, as though the forest itself had paused to watch. Every sound she had taken for granted fell away, leaving only her heartbeat and the faint, quick breaths of the pup. The pup froze mid-chew, meat forgotten, ears pricked forward, its small body rigid with tension. Tessa felt her own pulse spike, awareness sharpening in tandem with the creature's instincts. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice unnervingly loud in the oppressive quiet.
The pup whined
Softly, rising to its feet with a delicate, cautious grace, limping toward the door as if it knew something she did not, before glancing back at her with expectant, questioning eyes. The silence deepened, thickening in the corners of the cabin, curling around the hearth, pressing down on the warm, flickering firelight. Shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, exaggerating each movement and making familiar objects appear foreign, threatening.
Something was out there.
Something alive, patient, and intent. Tessa's heart quickened, each beat hammering against her chest, a deafening counterpoint to the stillness surrounding them.
For 3 months she had remained hidden.
3 months of careful steps, furtive glances, and whispered prayers to keep herself unseen. Every snap of twig, every rustle in the underbrush, had been a reminder of her precarious position.
Had the king's men finally found her?
Was the cabin surrounded now, some silent hunt closing in, ready to drag her back to a life she had fought so hard to escape? The pup scratched at the door with urgent insistence, tiny claws tapping against the wood, its whimper rising in a crescendo that mirrored Tessa's own mounting fear. Its amber eyes flicked toward her repeatedly, silently urging her to act, to do something to protect them both. Tessa's hands trembled as they reached for the iron poker beside the fire, the only weapon she possessed. Cold metal met her fingers, a thin reassurance against the uncertainty pressing from outside. It was a poor defense against any real threat, yet it offered something more of a sense of agency, however small, in the face of whatever waited beyond the cabin walls. She took a careful step toward the door, firelight flickering over the worn wood, each shadow elongating into shapes that might have been imagination or warning. Every instinct screamed caution. Every memory of months spent hiding whispered of danger, of betrayal, of the unforgiving hand of authority that had once tried to control her life. The forest beyond seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, silent yet electric, as if it were aware of her movement, measuring, judging. And the question that pressed against her mind, cold and insistent, demanded an answer. Was this the king's men at last, circling her refuge like predators? Or something older, more cunning, watching patiently from the darkness, waiting for a moment of weakness? The pup's whimpers grew sharper, scratching urgently at the door, nudging her with its small body, demanding action. Tessa's grip on the iron poker tightened, knuckles whitening, the weight of it strangely grounding. Her breaths came in shallow, rapid pulls, each one a measure of both fear and resolve. She could not know what waited outside, could not know whether the threat was mortal, magical, or something that had walked these woods long before humans dared. She pressed herself closer to the pup, heart hammering, the warmth of its tiny body offering a fragile counterbalance to the icy fear gripping her. And yet, in the quiet tension between the walls, another question rose, curling around her thoughts like smoke from the fire. Was she prepared to face what watched them, unseen, and would her courage and the pup's trust be enough to withstand it? Tessa moved cautiously to the door, pressing her ear against the rough, splintered wood. The forest's earlier murmur had vanished entirely, leaving a silence so absolute it pressed against her eardrums. Not a leaf stirred, not a bird called. Only the slow, shallow breaths of the pup against her chest reminded her that some life remained. Her fingers hovered over the latch, trembling. Every instinct screamed to bar the door, to hide, to vanish into the shadows and wait. But some deeper, restless curiosity or perhaps stubborn defiance would not let her. Slowly, deliberately, she eased the door open a crack. Her heart caught in her throat. A gasp escaped her lips as she took in the scene before her eyes. Wolves. Dozens of them, standing in a perfect, unnatural stillness. They formed a wide circle around the cabin, like sentinels, like a living boundary drawn by some unseen hand. Their fur shimmered in shades of silver gray, tawny gold, and deep brown, each one distinct, yet unified in presence. But it was their eyes that rooted her to the spot. The unnatural amber glow, identical to the pup's, reflected the morning light like polished coins. Each gaze was unblinking, ancient, and intense, as though measuring her soul rather than merely her body. Her chest tightened. She realized with a shiver that this was no ordinary pack. The forest had drawn them here for a reason, and whatever reason it was not random. The pup struggled against her legs, tiny paws scratching the floor, eager to dart into the clearing. "No," she whispered, voice soft but firm, trying to hold it back.
But instinct won.
With a determined squeeze, it wriggled past her legs before she could react, limping into the clearing with cautious, deliberate steps. Her pulse raced, and a chill ran down her spine. The wolves remained motionless, their amber eyes fixed on the pup as if it were the axis of some ritual she did not understand. And yet, there was no aggression, no growl, only an unsettling, watchful patience that pressed against her nerves like a living weight. Time seemed to stretch, elongated by fear and fascination alike. Then, as if some invisible current had swept through the circle, the wolves shifted with fluid grace. The pack parted like a tide, leaving a clear path leading away from the cabin. The clearing yawned open, a silent invitation or a test.
Tessa's breath caught again.
Every fiber of her being screamed caution, yet she could not look away. She knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary moment in the forest, and that watching, waiting, and following could shape the next chapter of both her life and the pup's in ways she could not yet imagine. The pup, small and trembling but unafraid, limped forward into the clearing, each step deliberate. Tessa's hands shook, still clutching the door frame, watching as the scene unfolded like a story written in the amber eyes of creatures older than memory. Her mind raced with questions she could not answer. Why had they come? What had summoned this silent, coordinated watch? And, most importantly, what would happen next? The pack remained in place, forming a perfect semicircle around the pup now standing alone in the clearing. And in that moment, Tessa realized with a shiver that the forest, the storm, and even the creatures themselves were all players in a story she had just stepped into, a story in which she, the pup, and perhaps even the Iron Monarch lurking unseen would be tested beyond imagination. A silence fell again, heavy and anticipatory, broken only by the faint drip of rain from the roof.
The wolves waited.
The pup paused mid-step, ears swiveling, amber eyes scanning the pack. And Tessa knew, in her bones, that the forest had set its stage, and they were the actors. But the question pressed down harder than the weight of any fear before: what would happen if she moved or if she stayed frozen? The pack shifted silently, parting just enough to create a narrow path through their midst. Tessa's breath caught, and her hands instinctively clenched the door frame. From the shadowed trees beyond, a figure emerged, no ordinary wolf. Massive shoulders rising higher than her waist, every muscle coiled beneath midnight black fur that seemed to drink the light. It moved with a liquid grace, each step precise and measured, power held in reserve like a storm waiting to break. Every instinct screamed reverence and caution. This was no creature of ordinary forest life. This was legend made flesh, a presence that carried weight before it even arrived. Tessa's heart pounded so loudly she feared it would betray her, echoing through the silent clearing. The black wolf's eyes, deep amber, yet impossibly intelligent, found hers. For a heartbeat, she forgot to breathe, frozen under the scrutiny of a gaze that felt like it could see her past, present, and some hidden future. There was something human in those eyes, something ancient and feral intertwined, as if the forest itself had distilled centuries of knowledge into this one formidable being. The pup yipped suddenly, shattering the hypnotic tension, tiny sound bouncing against the enormous presence before her. Instantly, a smaller gray wolf stepped forward from the pack, its movements gentle, careful. It nuzzled the pup with obvious relief, sniffing, brushing its warm muzzle along the little body in a silent gesture of reassurance. Tessa's chest swelled with recognition and awe. Its mother, she realized, watching the pup press instinctively against the female wolf's legs, its tiny body already soothed by the familiar touch. The black wolf, towering and immovable, lowered its massive head in a deliberate gesture, a bow that was both commanding and ceremonial. Every line of its body communicated intent, respect, authority, and recognition of the bond that had been reunited before her eyes. Tessa's mind struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of the scene: a pup she had rescued, a mother she had never known, and this black wolf, a presence that defied the ordinary, almost regal in its posture, acknowledging her silently, as if granting permission to witness the unfolding ritual of nature itself. Time seemed to stretch, every second elongated by the weight of awe and the storm of emotions swirling through Tessa's chest. She barely dared move, her gaze locked with the black wolf's, feeling the strange pulse of intelligence and awareness that radiated from it. Here, in the clearing, the forest had become an arena of ancient rites, where survival, trust, and mercy converged in ways she could not have imagined. The pup wagged its tiny tail nervously, ears twitching, still pressed close to its mother. The tension of the pack, The unspoken rules and silent authority seemed almost comical from the pup's perspective, tiny limbs against enormous shadows, but somehow, it mattered. Even in such a fantastical moment, life continued in its small, stubborn ways. The grey mother wolf shifted closer, pressing her side against the pup, nuzzling and grooming, communicating a relief that only a parent could express.
Tessa's chest tightened at the sight.
The pup was safe, reunited with its guardian. And yet, the presence of the black wolf hinted at something greater, a hierarchy and intelligence that transcended mere survival. She could feel it watching her, judging her, assessing not just her actions, but her intentions. The black wolf's gaze remained steady, unwavering. Every muscle in its enormous frame suggested power restrained, knowledge ancient and deliberate. Tessa realized that this creature had not appeared by chance. It had observed her, the pup, the delicate act of mercy, and now acknowledged her place tentatively, fragile, yet accepted within the moment. The black wolf lowered its massive head once more, a bow unmistakably deliberate enough that even Tessa felt its weight in her bones. In that single, commanding gesture, there was a message unspoken yet undeniable then. And her mind raced to fill the blank, knowing instinctively that what followed could shape everything she thought she knew about the forest, the wolves, and the unseen power that watched from the shadows. As if responding to an unheard command, every wolf in the clearing threw back its head and howled in perfect, synchronized resonance. The sound rolled across the forest like a living wave, deep and haunting, vibrating through the trunks of the trees, curling around the cabin, and washing over Tessa like a tangible force. Her chest reverberated with each note, her arms tingling as fine hairs rose along her skin. She had never heard anything like it, not the wild calls of ordinary wolves, not the distant cries of the river. This was purposeful, ancient, and strangely, thankful. The howl seemed to speak directly to her, a message carried through a language she could feel if not understand. Gratitude, or perhaps recognition, pulsed in every note, as if the forest itself were acknowledging her courage and mercy in rescuing the pup. A shiver ran down her spine. She realized, with a mix of fear and awe, that she had just stepped into a world governed by codes older than human memory, a realm where life, trust, and survival were negotiated not with words, but with gestures, presence, and acts of bravery. When the last echo faded into the damp morning air, the black wolf turned smoothly and vanished into the shadows of the forest. The clearing fell into silence once more, yet the other wolves remained. Their perfect circle had not faltered. They were still there, eyes locked on her, unblinking and inscrutable, amber orbs reflecting the soft, filtered light. Every movement Tessa made, every small breath, seemed magnified in their gaze. The weight of their attention pressed against her like an invisible hand, simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. Moments later, the black wolf reappeared, emerging from the trees with a deliberate, almost ceremonial gait. Clutched in its jaws was the carcass of a young deer, muscles rippling beneath the midnight fur, legs folded with precise care. The sheer scale of the creature and the precision of its movement held Tessa rooted, her mind struggling to reconcile the surreal majesty of the moment. This was no random act. It was a calculated, deliberate gift, a silent acknowledgement of her role in the pup's survival. With careful, measured steps, the black wolf approached the cabin doorway. Each footfall was deliberate, controlled, a reminder of the raw power beneath the black fur. Then, with the same exacting precision, it dropped the deer at her feet, the carcass landing softly on the earth without a single scuff or misstep. The wolf paused, body rigid, eyes piercing, never leaving her face. Its presence alone communicated expectation, patience, and an unspoken understanding of reciprocity.
This is your gift. What will you do with it?
Tessa's gaze traveled over the deer, marveling at its size and the unexpected generosity of the black wolf. This offering could feed her for weeks, possibly through the harshest cold yet to come. And yet, the gift carried more weight than mere sustenance. It carried significance, a wordless pact between human and forest, predator and survivor, a momentary bridging of worlds that rarely intersected. The wolf remained a rigid sentinel, each muscle taut beneath its sleek coat, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that bordered on interrogation. Tessa could feel the weight of every second in its gaze, the unspoken demand for recognition, acknowledgement, or perhaps even gratitude returned. Her pulse raced as she understood that in the wild, reciprocity was never optional. Survival, respect, and trust were intertwined in a single, delicate dance. She crouched slightly, hand hovering over the carcass, her mind working through hesitation, awe and an instinctive sense of ritual. Every fiber of her being was alert, knowing the wolf's gaze measured her intent with unerring precision. This was more than survival. It was a test, a moment where her courage, respect for life, and awareness of consequence all converged. Finally, Tessa extended a cautious hand toward the deer, fingertips trembling just slightly as they brushed the animal's fur. The black wolf's gaze never wavered, a living mirror of patience and assessment. It did not move, did not growl or step forward. It simply waited, as if to measure her reaction, teaching her the delicate lesson that trust, once earned, demanded careful honor. Her fingers made contact with the deer, tentative at first, then firmer as she realized she controlled nothing but her own movements. The wolf's eyes seemed to bore into her very soul, a silent dialogue passing between them. I give, but will you respect the gift? Will you rise to meet what follows? Tessa felt the enormity of that question settle deep in her chest, knowing instinctively that the answer would shape more than just this day. It would shape her place in the forest, and perhaps the fate of the pup she had saved. Something impossible happened. The black wolf rose onto its hind legs with a fluid, unnatural motion that defied everything Tessa had ever known about nature or physics. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back, pressing against the doorframe for support, fingers digging into the rough wood as if it could anchor her to reality. The transformation was hypnotic and terrifying at once, a violent grace that made her pulse hammer in her ears. The wolf's form rippled like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, fur shimmering, receding, melting into shadows that revealed muscle and sinew stretching and coiling beneath. Limbs elongated with impossible precision, a spine straightening as bones shifted audibly beneath the skin, each crack and snap echoing like a distant thunderclap. Tessa's eyes widened, her mind struggling to reconcile predator and human, myth and flesh. Where the wolf had stood moments ago, now a figure rose, taller than any man she had ever seen, every movement deliberate, every line of his body radiating power restrained by an unspoken command. His shoulders were broad, arms corded with muscle that suggested both speed and unrelenting strength. The skin was bronzed, burnished by years of sun and survival, each scar a story of past battles and experience that Tessa could only imagine. Dark hair fell past his shoulders in wild, untamed waves, moving with a life of its own as if echoing the shadows cast by the forest. Around his neck hung a thin chain with a pendant that caught the morning light, glinting like a signal she could not yet read, something both decorative and symbolic, ancient in its quiet weight. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. The amber, intelligent eyes she had seen staring at her from the wolf's face now locked onto hers, human in shape yet still burning with that feral awareness. They held recognition, judgment, and something else, something ancient, almost predatory, like a measure of her courage, her mercy, and the choices that had led her to this moment. For a heartbeat, Tessa felt suspended between awe and terror, unable to move or speak. Human in shape now, yet impossibly aware, he radiated an energy that Tessa could feel pressing against her chest. Every instinct screamed caution, yet part of her could not look away, drawn as if by gravity to the raw, commanding presence of this being. She could sense the wolf beneath the man, the predator that had guided the pack and orchestrated this encounter, still alive in muscle, posture, and intent.